In the American Airlines Center in Dallas, a quiet, faith-filled actor was about to be dragged into a fight he never asked for. A charity night meant to celebrate opportunity turned deadly when a rising combat sports star and his entourage began mocking him from inside the cage. Denzel Washington wasn't your typical VIP guest. For 7 years, he had supported youth scholarships in silence long before the cameras ever cared, while living a life shaped by discipline, scripture, and a private commitment to service. When Razor Cade and his corner escalated their taunts into open ridicule of Denzel's faith, they had no idea they were provoking the wrong audience. Chuck Norris stepped from his seat with the stillness of a man who had already decided the outcome. With calculated calm, he entered the cage, executing a tactical response that would trigger a seismic shift in the arena. What began as a charity exhibition would become a reckoning. The Dallas crowd and the entire combat sports world would never be the same after the night Chuck Norris made the mockers bleed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The floodlights carved through the smoky haze, hanging over the American Airlines Center in Dallas, illuminating the octagonal cage that sat like a steel altar at the center of the arena. 20,000 voices merged into a thunderous wall of sound that seemed to press against the rafters, each cheer and chant adding another layer to the electric atmosphere. Cameras swept across the crowd in slow arcs, catching glimpses of painted faces, homemade signs, and the kind of raw energy that only comes when violence and entertainment collide under the bright lights of spectacle. This wasn't just another fight night. The banners hanging from the ceiling told a different story. Champions for Change, fighting for the Future Scholarship Fund charity exhibition. Every dollar from tonight's gate would flow into educational scholarships for underprivileged youth across Texas, a cause that had drawn some unexpected faces to the VIP section. In the third row, ringside, Denzel Washington sat with the quiet composure of a man who had learned long ago that presence didn't require performance. Dressed in a charcoal suit with an open collar, no tie, he embodied understated elegance. His hands rested calmly on his knees, fingers interlaced, as he watched the pre-fight ceremonies with the focused attention of someone genuinely invested in the cause. This was his 7th year supporting the scholarship program, though few knew it. He didn't announce his donations or pose for charity photos. He simply showed up, wrote the checks, and believed in the mission, giving kids a path out of circumstances that might otherwise define their limits. The arena's pulse quickened as Trent Holloway's voice boomed through the sound system, his commentary crackling with practiced enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Hollywood royalty in the house tonight. Academy Award winner Denzel Washington is here supporting our scholarship drive, along with martial arts legend Chuck Norris. These gentlemen understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. The camera found Chuck Norris 2 seats over from Denzel, and the crowd erupted in appreciation. Where Denzel projected calm, Chuck embodied stillness, the kind that comes from decades of discipline and a lifetime of knowing exactly who you are. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp and alert despite his 70-plus years. He wore simple black jeans and a dark jacket, no flash, no need for it. When the spotlight hit him, he raised one hand in acknowledgement, then settled back into observation mode. Chuck had come tonight for the same reason as Denzel. He believed in giving kids opportunities to become something more than their circumstances suggested. The crowd's energy shifted as the main event fighters began their entrances. First came Tommy "Iron" Rodriguez, a weathered veteran with 38 professional fights under his belt. Rodriguez walked to the cage with the measured pace of a craftsman heading to work. No dancing, no theatrics, just the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his place through years of showing up and doing the job. The crowd appreciated him, but they weren't here for quiet professionalism. They were here for what came next. The lights dimmed, bass dropped through the speakers like thunder, and Razor Ryland Cade exploded through the entrance tunnel like a force of nature unleashed. 24 years old, undefeated in 14 professional fights, and built like a weapon. Designed specifically for hurting people. His record wasn't just about wins, it was about dominance, about turning opponents into cautionary tales. He didn't just beat fighters. He dismantled them, broke them down piece by piece, and then made sure everyone remembered how it felt to watch. Razor's entrance was pure theater. He shadowboxed his way down the aisle, throwing combinations at invisible opponents, his movements sharp and explosive. His cornrows were pulled back tight, his lean frame rippling with muscle that seemed to twitch with barely contained violence. The crowd split down the middle, half roaring their approval for his skill and charisma, the other half booing the arrogance that dripped from every gesture. From her position in Razor's corner, Coach Lita Moreno watched her fighter's performance with the conflicted expression of someone who had created something she wasn't entirely proud of. Lita had been where Razor was now, a young champion drunk on her own invincibility. But age and experience had taught her the difference between confidence and cruelty. She had taken Razor in when he was 17, angry and fighting in parking lot brawls for grocery money. She had given him discipline, technique, and a path forward. What she hadn't been able to give him was humility. "Stay focused," she called out as Razor climbed into the cage, though she knew he was already lost in the moment, feeding off the crowd's energy like a predator scenting blood. Trent's voice cut through the noise. Razor Cade has become one of the most polarizing figures in combat sports. Love him or hate him, you cannot ignore the devastation this young man brings to the cage. In the VIP section, Denzel and Chuck watched the spectacle with different eyes than the fans around them. Where others saw entertainment, they saw a young man on the edge of learning a hard lesson about the difference between talent and character. Denzel had been around long enough to recognize the type. Gifted beyond measure, but hungry for validation in all the wrong ways. Chuck's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a guard dog's ears perk up at a sound only it can hear. The bell rang, and 14 months of anticipation exploded into motion. Rodriguez moved with the patience of experience, circling, measuring distance, looking for openings that might not come for several rounds. But Razor had no intention of letting this drag on. He came forward like a storm surge, hands high, footwork sharp, cutting off the veteran's angles with the kind of pressure that comes from knowing you're faster, stronger, and meaner than the man across from you. The first exchange told the story. Rodriguez threw a testing jab, and Razor slipped it effortlessly, countering with a left hook that snapped the older fighter's head around. The crowd gasped at the speed and precision. This wasn't going to be a long night. Razor pressed forward, his strikes coming in waves, jabs to set up power shots, kicks to break down Rodriguez's base, combinations that flowed together like choreographed violence. Each time Rodriguez tried to create space, Razor cut him off. Each time the veteran attempted to tie him up, Razor made him pay with uppercuts to the body that folded him over. By the middle of the first round, it was clear that Rodriguez was surviving, not competing. His face already showed the early signs of damage. A cut over his left eye, swelling around his cheekbone. But what made the crowd uncomfortable wasn't the beating itself. It was how much Razor seemed to be enjoying it. "You done already, old man?" Razor taunted between combinations loud enough for the front rows to hear when Rodriguez fired back with a desperate overhand right. Razor ducked under it and laughed. Actually laughed before driving a knee into the veteran's ribs that doubled him over. Lita shouted from the corner, "Stop playing! Finish it!" But Razor wasn't playing. He was savoring. Each strike was calculated not just to damage, but to humiliate. When Rodriguez stumbled backward against the fence, Razor followed him there and began working the body with methodical cruelty. Each punch punctuated by whispered insults that only his opponent could hear. The VIP section, Denzel's jaw tightened. This wasn't competition anymore. It was bullying with an audience. Chuck's hands slowly formed fists, where they rested on his knees, though his expression never changed. The end came with brutal suddenness. Rodriguez, desperate and hurt, threw a wild haymaker that left him completely off balance. Razor stepped inside it, caught him with a perfect uppercut that lifted his feet off the canvas, then followed with a right cross that sent the veteran crashing into the fence before sliding down to the mat like a marionette with its strings cut. The referee dove in immediately, waving his arms to signal the stoppage as medical personnel rushed into the cage. Rodriguez lay motionless for several seconds, eyes unfocused, before slowly beginning to stir. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Cheers from those who appreciated the technical display, but an undercurrent of discomfort from those who had witnessed something that felt less like sport and more like cruelty. Razor stood over his fallen opponent, chest heaving, sweat glistening under the lights. He raised his arms in triumph, but his eyes were already scanning the crowd, hungry for more. The victory wasn't enough. It was never enough. As the medical team helped Rodriguez to his stool, the veteran's corner, wrapping ice around his neck and checking his pupils, Razor paced the cage like a caged animal that had tasted blood and wanted more. He grabbed the microphone from the ring announcer, his breathing still heavy from the fight, but his voice carried clearly over the crowd's noise. "You see that?" he shouted, pointing at the medical team still attending to Rodriguez. "That's what happens when you step in here with me. That's what real fighting looks like." The crowd's energy was shifting, becoming less celebratory and more uneasy. This wasn't the gracious victory speech they were accustomed to hearing from champions. But Razor wasn't finished. His eyes swept across the VIP section, taking in the celebrities and dignitaries who had come to support the charity. His gaze lingered on the cameras that were broadcasting this moment to millions around the world. This was his stage, his moment, and he wasn't going to waste it on false humility. From the commentators' table, Trent's voice carried a note of concern. Razor Cade has always been known for his colorful personality, but this post-fight behavior is definitely pushing some boundaries here tonight. In the cage, Razor continued his victory lap, soaking in the mixture of cheers and boos that rose from the crowd like steam. He had won, dominated, and proven once again that he was the future of the sport. But as he celebrated, he remained unaware that he was about to cross a line that would transform this night from a simple display of athletic superiority into something much more personal, much more dangerous. The arena pulsed with tension and energy. 20,000 people caught between admiration for his skill and distaste for his arrogance. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the scene to homes across the country, where viewers were beginning to form their own opinions about what they were witnessing. In the VIP section, Denzel watched with the expression of a man who had seen too much of the world to be easily shocked, but who still felt disappointment when talent was wasted on cruelty. Beside him, Chuck Norris remained motionless, his experienced eyes taking in not just what was happening, but what was about to happen. The night was young, and Razor Cade was just getting started. The metallic taste of blood hung in the air as medics worked over Tommy Rodriguez, their movements efficient and practiced. His eyes tracked slowly, pupils responding to the penlight. but the glazed expression told the story of a man who had just been reminded why fighting was a young man's game. The canvas beneath him showed dark spots where sweat and blood had mixed, creating an abstract map of violence that would be mopped clean before the next fight. Razor paced the perimeter of the cage like a predator marking territory, his chest still rising and falling with the rhythm of controlled aggression. The adrenaline coursed through his veins like electricity, making every nerve ending feel alive, hyper-R. This was his favorite moment. The seconds after victory, when the world belonged to him completely. When every eye in the arena was forced to acknowledge his superiority. "Get up," he called toward Rodriguez, his voice cutting through the medical team's quiet instructions. "You ain't hurt that bad. Get up and show these people what a real fighter looks like." Lita Moreno's voice cracked like a whip from the corner. "Ryland, enough." She rarely used his first name during fights, saving it for moments when he needed to remember who he was underneath the persona. But Razor was too deep in his performance to hear her, too drunk on the crowd's energy to care about consequences. The veteran fighter struggled to sit upright on his stool, his cornermen supporting him as the ring doctor checked his responses. Rodriguez had been in enough fights to know the routine, but the fog in his brain made everything feel distant, underwater. He tried to wave off the medical attention, the proud gesture of a warrior who didn't want to appear weak, but his hand trembled as he lifted it. Razor noticed the tremor and laughed. Not the good-natured chuckle of a competitor acknowledging a tough opponent, but something colder, more calculating. He leaned against the cage fence nearest to Rodriguez and called out, "Look at those hands shaking. 38 fights and this is how it ends. Maybe it's time to find a new hobby, Grandpa." The crowd's reaction was immediate and polarized. Razor's supporters, mostly younger fans, who had grown up in an era where trash talk was considered entertainment, cheered louder. But a different sound began emerging from other sections. Boos, jeers, the ugly noise of a crowd, turning. These were fight fans who understood the difference between confidence and cruelty, who recognized that what they were witnessing wasn't sport anymore. Trent Holloway's voice strained through the commentary as he tried to maintain professional objectivity. "Well, folks, Razor Cade is certainly expressing himself here tonight. I have to say this level of post-fight commentary is unusual even for a fighter known for his outspoken personality." His broadcast partner, former middleweight champion Maria Santos, was less diplomatic. "This is embarrassing, Trent. Rodriguez is a respected veteran who came here tonight to support a charity. This kind of disrespect has no place in our sport." But Razor was beyond caring about professional opinions or crowd reactions. The microphone in his hand felt like a weapon, and he wielded it with the same precision he brought to his fighting. He had spent years building his brand on controversy, understanding that hate was just as valuable as love when it came to selling tickets and generating social media buzz. "You want to see the difference between yesterday and tomorrow?" he shouted, gesturing toward Rodriguez and then back to himself. "Look right here. This is what happens when the old guard meets the new breed." In the VIP section, the energy was different, where the general crowd split between cheers and boos. Here, the reaction was more subdued, more judgmental. These were people who had achieved success in their own fields, who understood the difference between confidence born from accomplishment and arrogance born from insecurity. Denzel Washington's expression had hardened almost imperceptibly. His hands remained folded, his posture unchanged. But something in his eyes had shifted. He had spent decades in an industry where egos ran wild, where talented people destroyed themselves and others with their need for constant validation. He recognized the type, and it always saddened him to see raw talent twisted by such desperate hunger for attention. Chuck Norris sat with the stillness of deep water, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle signs of his growing displeasure. His jaw was set a fraction tighter. His shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Chuck had dedicated his life to martial arts, not for the glory or the spotlight, but for the discipline and respect it taught. Watching those values being trampled by someone who should have been honoring them struck him as a personal insult to everything he held sacred. The medical team finally helped Rodriguez to his feet, the veteran fighter showing the quiet dignity that had defined his long career. He nodded to the crowd, acknowledging their applause, and began the slow walk toward the exit. His steps were measured but steady, the walk of a man who had given everything he had and could hold his head high regardless of the outcome. Razor watched him leave and couldn't resist one final jab. That's right. Walk away. Make room for the future. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The boos grew louder, more sustained. Security guards positioned themselves at various points around the arena, not because they expected trouble from the crowd, but because they recognized the mood was shifting in the ways that could become unpredictable. Lita had seen enough. She climbed the steps to the cage and grabbed her fighter by the arm, her grip firm enough to get his attention, even through his adrenaline-fueled high. "That's enough," she hissed, her voice low, but carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "You won. Show some class." But Razor shook her off, the microphone still gripped in his hand like a lifeline to relevance. "Class," he repeated loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "I'm not here to be classy. I'm here to be real. This is what real fighters look like. What real fighting is about." He turned toward the VIP section, his eyes scanning the faces of the celebrities and dignitaries who had come to support the charity. His gaze swept past business executives and local politicians, past retired athletes and entertainment figures before landing on the two men who commanded attention simply by their presence. "Speaking of real," Razor continued, his voice taking on a different edge, "we got some movie stars here tonight, pretending to know about fighting." The arena quieted slightly, sensing that something was shifting, that the post-fight celebration was evolving into something more personal and potentially more dangerous. In the VIP section, both Denzel and Chuck remained motionless, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the way Chuck's hands slowly uncurled from their relaxed position and reformed into loose fists. Razor's smile was predatory as he pointed the microphone toward the section where Hollywood's finest sat. "Must be nice to have stunt doubles and special effects make you look tough," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the P system. "But this right here, this is what real toughness looks like." The crowd's reaction was a mixture of gasps and nervous laughter. This was new territory, even for a fighter known for pushing boundaries. Calling out celebrities in the audience was one thing, but there was something in Razor's tone that suggested he wasn't finished, that this was building towards something bigger. Trent's voice carried genuine concern now. "Oh my. It appears that Razor Cade is directing some comments toward our VIP guests. I'm not sure this is the direction we want to be heading here tonight." Lita made another attempt to get through to her fighter, moving closer and speaking directly into his ear. But Razor was beyond coaching now, beyond the influence of the woman who had saved him from the streets and given him a future. He was operating on pure instinct, the kind that had served him well in the cage, but was about to lead him into deeper waters than he had ever navigated. The microphone felt hot in his hand as he prepared to cross a line that would transform this night from a simple display of athletic dominance into something much more personal, much more dangerous. The crowd sensed it too, their noise level dropping as they waited to see how far this young fighter was willing to push. In the VIP section, 20 feet away from the cage, two of the most respected figures in American entertainment sat quietly, their calm exterior masking the growing tension beneath. They had come here tonight to support a cause they believed in, to help raise money for kids who needed chances they had never been given. They had not come to be part of the show. But as Razor's eyes fixed on them with laser focus, it became clear that choice was being taken out of their hands. The night was about to become something none of them had anticipated, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the confines of this arena. The arena's energy crystallized into something sharp and uncomfortable as Razor's attention shifted from general showboating to laser focus on the VIP section. 20,000 people seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the night was about to veer into uncharted territory. The bright lights cast harsh shadows across Razor's face as he wiped sweat from his brow, the microphone amplifying every breath, every sound of his post-fight adrenaline still coursing through his system. "You know what I love about this crowd," Razor said, his voice carrying a dangerous playfulness as he paced inside the cage. "They came here for real fighting, real violence, real consequences. Not some Hollywood fairy tale where the good guy always wins because he believes hard enough." His eyes found their target with predatory precision. Denzel Washington sat in the third row, his composure unchanged despite the obvious shift in the fighter's attention. There was something about Denzel's calm that seemed to irritate Razor, the way absolute stillness can make chaos feel even more frantic by comparison. "Hey, Denzel," Razor called out, pointing directly at the Academy Award winner. "I see you sitting there all quiet and dignified. Heard you're a real religious man, always talking about faith and prayer in your interviews." The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Gasps from those who couldn't believe what they were hearing, nervous laughter from others who thought this might be part of some pre-planned entertainment, and a growing undercurrent of boos from fans who recognized this was crossing into territory that had nothing to do with sport. Denzel's expression didn't change. His hands remained folded in his lap, his posture erect but relaxed, his eyes meeting Razor's stare with the kind of steady gaze that comes from decades of facing down everything from demanding directors to aggressive paparazzi. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something you defended with words. It was something you maintained through action, or sometimes through the conscious choice of inaction. But Razor interpreted the silence as invitation to continue. "Must be nice believing in something bigger than yourself," he said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Tell me, does all that faith help when someone's trying to cave your skull in? Can you pray your way out of a real fight?" Trent Holloway's voice carried genuine distress through the commentary. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is highly unusual. I'm not sure what's happening here, but this seems to be getting very personal very quickly." In the VIP section, Security Chief Mason Briggs shifted position slightly, his trained eyes moving between Razor and the celebrities, calculating distances and potential responses. He had worked enough high-profile events to know when a situation was teetering on the edge of something ugly. His hand moved unconsciously toward his radio, ready to call for backup if this escalated beyond verbal harassment. Razor fed off the crowd's energy like a parasite, their discomfort only serving to fuel his performance. I respect the hustle," he continued, his voice getting louder, more theatrical. "Making movies about being tough, playing heroes who always save the day. But this right here, He gestured at the cage around him, at the blood still visible on the canvas. This is real life. No stunt doubles, no second takes, no director yelling cut when things get ugly. From her position at ringside, Lita Moreno was frantically trying to get her fighter's attention, making slashing motions across her throat to signal that he needed to stop. She had seen Razor's hunger for attention lead him into controversial territory before. But this felt different, more dangerous. She knew the young man's history, understood the deep wells of insecurity that drove his need for validation. But she also recognized when someone was about to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. "Ryland!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the arena noise. "That's enough. You won the fight. Time to go." But Razor was beyond her reach now, caught up in a performance that felt more real to him than any scripted movie scene. He could see the cameras capturing every moment, knew that this footage would be replaying on social media within minutes, generating the kind of buzz and controversy that his career thrived on. "What do you say, Denzel?" Razor pressed, his voice taking on a mocking sing-gong quality. "Want to come up here and test that faith against something real? See if your prayers can block a right hook?" The arena had grown noticeably quieter, the kind of hush that falls over a crowd when they realize they're witnessing something that will be talked about long after the lights go down. Phones were out everywhere now, thousands of people recording what was either going to be an epic moment of celebrity confrontation or a career-destroying display of poor judgment. Denzel finally moved, but not in the way the crowd expected. He didn't stand, didn't shout back, didn't rise to the bait being so obviously dangled in front of him. Instead, he simply shook his head once, slowly, the gesture carrying more disappointment than anger. Then he looked away from Razor entirely, turning his attention to the program in his hands, as if the young fighter had ceased to exist entirely. The dismissal was complete and devastating in its quiet totality. For all his hunger for attention, for all his need to provoke a reaction, Razor had been rendered irrelevant by a man who simply refused to acknowledge his relevance. But instead of taking the hint, Razor doubled down. "Oh, now you're too good to even look at me," he called out, his voice getting higher, more desperate. "That's what I thought. All that talk about strength and faith. But when it's time to back it up, you hide behind your publicist and your security guards." The crowd's boos were getting louder now, more sustained. This had stopped being entertaining and started being ugly. Even Razor's supporters were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that their fighter was making himself look small by attacking someone who was refusing to engage. Chuck Norris had remained motionless throughout the exchange. But those who knew him would have recognized the subtle signs of his growing displeasure. His jaw was set tighter. His shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before, and his hands had slowly formed into fists where they rested on his knees. Razor, desperate now for any reaction that would validate his performance, pushed even further into dangerous territory. "Maybe that's what's wrong with this country," he shouted, his voice echoing through the arena. "Too many people hiding behind fairy tales and not enough willing to face reality. Your faith ain't going to save you when someone wants to hurt you for real." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Razor seemed to realize he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But his pride and adrenaline wouldn't let him back down. The crowd's energy had shifted from entertainment to genuine anger. Their boos now mixed with calls for security to remove him from the cage. In the VIP section, Denzel continued to study his program with the kind of focused attention that spoke volumes about his refusal to be drawn into a confrontation with someone so clearly beneath his notice. His faith wasn't something he needed to defend with words or fists. It was something he lived, something that informed every decision he made, including the decision to maintain his dignity in the face of ignorant provocation. But beside him, Chuck Norris was stirring. Not with anger, not with the hot fury that Razor was trying to provoke, but with something colder and more purposeful. Chuck had spent his entire life studying martial arts, not for the glory or the violence, but for the discipline and respect they represented. Watching those values being trampled by someone who should have been honoring them was striking him as a personal insult to everything he held sacred. The arena held its collective breath as Chuck slowly, deliberately began to uncross his arms. His movement was minimal, subtle, but in that moment it carried the weight of inevitability. The crowd sensed something was shifting, that the night was about to take another turn into territory none of them had anticipated. Razor, still clutching the microphone, finally seemed to notice the change in atmosphere. His eyes swept the VIP section again, no longer seeking easy targets, but beginning to sense that he might have awakened something he wasn't prepared to handle. The silence stretched taut as 20,000 people waited to see what would happen next. Their collective attention focused on two men who represented entirely different approaches to strength, faith, and the choice of when to stand up and when to remain seated. The night was far from over, and Razor Cade was about to learn that some lines once crossed lead to consequences that no amount of talent or bravado can overcome. The silence in the arena felt alive, pregnant with the kind of tension that precedes moments people remember for the rest of their lives. 20,000 fans held their collective breath as Chuck Norris slowly, deliberately, began to rise from some key to his seat. The movement was unhurried, controlled, but carried the weight of inevitability, like watching a mountain decide to move. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Where moments before Chuck had been simply another distinguished guest in the VIP section, now he became something else entirely. A force of nature preparing to assert itself against an injustice that demanded correction. His weathered hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he pushed himself upright, the motion revealing decades of disciplined training in the fluid way his body moved. Despite his age, Chuck stood to his full height and methodically folded the charity program he had been holding. His movements precise and economical. The program featured photos of scholarship recipients, young faces full of hope and determination, kids who had been given chances to escape circumstances that might otherwise have defined their limits. He handed the program to the person seated behind him with the kind of automatic courtesy that spoke to a lifetime of discipline and respect. But his eyes never left the cage where Razor continued his verbal assault on everything Chuck held sacred. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. It started with a single voice somewhere in the upper deck. Chuck, then another closer to the ring. Chuck Norris. Within seconds, scattered voices began, calling his name from all corners of the arena. The chant started small, but grew like a wildfire, spreading from section to section as more people realized what they were witnessing. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. The sound built and layered upon itself, creating a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Phone cameras swiveled toward him like flowers following the sun, capturing every moment of what was already being recognized as a historic confrontation. The arena's video screens flickered to life, showing Chuck's measured approach from multiple angles, broadcasting his deliberate movements to millions of viewers watching around the world. Inside the cage, Razor's performance faltered for the first time all night. His grip on the microphone tightened as he watched the 70-plus-year-old legend moving with purpose toward the cage area. The young fighter's eyes darted between Chuck and the crowd, suddenly aware that the narrative he had been controlling was slipping away from him. "No way," Razor said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and excitement. The old man's actually going to try something. He forced a laugh, but it came out hollow, lacking the confident ring that had characterized his earlier taunts. "This ain't going to be like your movies, Grandpa. This is real life." But there was a tremor in his voice now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there when he was taunting Denzel. Facing a man who refused to engage was one thing. Facing someone who was clearly prepared to meet disrespect with action was something entirely different. Razor had built his career on intimidating opponents before fights ever began, using psychological warfare to establish dominance. Now he found himself on the receiving end of something far more unsettling. Calm, purposeful intent. Security Chief Mason Briggs intercepted Chuck as he reached the barrier, separating the VIP section from the cage area. Mason was a 20-year veteran of high-profile event security, a former Special Forces operator who had worked everywhere from presidential rallies to championship boxing matches without incident. His instinct was to de-escalate any situation that might spiral out of control, to maintain the careful order that kept 20,000 people safe in one building. But as Mason looked into Chuck's eyes, he saw something that made him pause. This wasn't the hot anger of a fan who'd had too much to drink, or the manufactured outrage of someone seeking attention. What Mason recognized in Chuck's steady gaze was something far more dangerous and far more respectable. Moral certainty backed by the kind of quiet confidence that only came from a lifetime of testing oneself against real challenges. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," Mason began, his voice professional, but not unkind. He respected Chuck too much to be dismissive, but protocol demanded that he at least attempt to maintain order. "I understand you're upset about what's happening, but I can't allow civilians in the cage area." Chuck stopped and faced the security chief directly, his posture relaxed, but somehow commanding attention. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. The tone of someone accustomed to being listened to, not because of his position, but because of who he was. "I know you're doing your job, son," Chuck said, his tone respectful but unwavering. "But some things are more important than protocol. That young man in there just attacked something bigger than himself or me. He went after faith itself, and someone needs to show him what that actually looks like when it's tested." They stood facing each other for several seconds, two professionals assessing each other across a divide of duty and principle. Mason had seen enough real violence in his military career to recognize the difference between chaos and controlled purpose. What he saw in Chuck wasn't rage or wounded pride. It was something far more dangerous. The quiet determination of someone who had found a line that couldn't be crossed without consequence. Around them, the crowd's energy was building to a fever pitch. The chant of Chuck's name had evolved into something approaching a battle cry. 20,000 voices united in their desire to see someone stand up to Razor's increasingly ugly behavior. Camera phones were everywhere now, capturing every moment of the confrontation between the security chief and the legend. "You sure about this?" Mason asked quietly, his hand hovering near his radio, but making no move to call for backup. His question carried layers of meaning. Was Chuck certain he wanted to risk his reputation, his safety, his legacy on a confrontation with a fighter 40 years his junior? Chuck's response was a single nod, but it contained multitudes. In that gesture was the accumulated weight of 5 decades of martial arts training, of a lifetime spent believing that strength was meaningless without the moral foundation to direct it properly. It was the nod of a man who had faced down Hollywood executives and foreign dictators, who had built a career on the principle that sometimes you had to stand up and be counted regardless of the personal cost. Mason studied Chuck's face for another heartbeat, then stepped aside. It was a decision that spoke to his judgment as much as his experience. Sometimes the best way to prevent a situation from getting completely out of hand was to let the right person handle it before it escalated further. He had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was operating from principle rather than ego. And everything about Chuck's demeanor suggested this was about something larger than personal pride. "All right," Mason said quietly, keying his radio. "All units, we have a situation developing in the cage area. Stand by, but do not intervene unless I give the direct order. This needs to play out." His team's voices crackled back through his earpiece. Professional confirmations that they understood the unusual nature of the situation. Arena security had dealt with fan rushes and celebrity confrontations before, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that carried the weight of genuine moral conflict rather than simple crowd control. The crowd's energy shifted dramatically as Chuck walked past the security barrier and began approaching the cage. The chant of his name grew louder, more sustained. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. But there was also a hushed quality to the noise, an awareness that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the modern era of combat sports. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a manufactured controversy. This was real, with real consequences for everyone involved. Trent Holloway's voice strained through the commentary as he tried to process what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is absolutely unprecedented. Chuck Norris is approaching the cage area, and I honestly have no idea what the protocol is for a situation like this. In 30 years of calling fights, I have never seen anything remotely comparable to what we're witnessing here tonight." His broadcast partner, Maria Santos, was equally stunned. "Trent, this has gone so far beyond sport that I don't even know what category to put it in anymore. This is about respect, about values, about the kind of person you choose to be when the cameras are rolling and the world is watching." Chuck's approach to the cage was deliberate, measured, each step taken with the kind of conscious intention that comes from a lifetime of understanding that actions have consequences. He wasn't rushing toward confrontation. He was walking toward inevitability, carrying himself with the dignified bearing of someone who had made a decision and would see it through regardless of the outcome. As he passed the rows of VIP seating, other celebrities and dignitaries watched with expressions ranging from concern to admiration to simple amazement. These were people accustomed to manufactured drama and scripted conflicts. But what they were witnessing carried the unmistakable weight of authenticity. Chuck paused briefly at Denzel's seat as he passed, the movement so subtle that only those in the immediate vicinity noticed. The two men exchanged a look that carried the weight of decades of mutual respect and shared values. In Denzel's eyes was something that might have been gratitude, not for personal protection, which he had never requested, but for someone stepping up to defend principles that transcended individual pride. "You don't have to do this," Denzel said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. There was no fear in his tone, no request for intervention, just the concern of one friend for another's well-being. Chuck's response was equally quiet, but carried the finality of a man who had made his decision. "I know that's exactly why I'm doing it. Some things are worth standing up for, especially when nobody asks you to." The exchange lasted no more than a few seconds, but it encapsulated everything that had led to this moment. This wasn't about ego or personal slight. It was about the responsibility that came with strength, the obligation to use one's capabilities in service of something larger than oneself. As Chuck continued his walk toward the cage, Razor's demeanor underwent a subtle but noticeable change. The cocky swagger remained, but there was something defensive creeping into his posture. a recognition that he was no longer controlling the narrative. His bouncing on the balls of his feet became more nervous than confident, his eyes darting between Chuck and the exits as he calculated options that suddenly seemed far more limited than they had moments before. Well, Razor said into the microphone, his voice artificially loud and cheerful as he tried to regain control of the moment. Looks like the movies are coming to real life. You're really going to step in here, old man. You know this ain't Hollywood, right? No, clears throat stunt coordinators, no safety mats, no director to yell cut when things get ugly. But even as he spoke, Razor's eyes were measuring Chuck's approach, noting the way the older man moved, economical, balanced, with the kind of body awareness that comes from a lifetime of physical discipline. There was nothing frail or hesitant in Chuck's gait, nothing that suggested age had diminished his capabilities in any meaningful way. The crowd sensed the shift in dynamic as clearly as the fighters did. Where moments before they had been watching a young champion mock an elder statesman, now they were witnessing something far more complex. The approach of consequence towards someone who had convinced himself he was beyond accountability. Chuck reached the cage entrance and paused, the gesture carrying the weight of finality. He removed his jacket with the same methodical precision he had shown in rising from his seat. His movements unhurried despite the 20,000 people watching his every gesture. The jacket was expensive, but understated. The clothing choice of someone who understood that true class didn't require announcement. He folded the jacket carefully and handed it to Mason, who had followed at a respectful distance. Chuck's white shirt was crisp and clean, his jeans fitted but comfortable. The clothes of a man who had dressed for a charity event, not a fight, but who was prepared to adapt to changing circumstances. "Last chance to back down, Grandpa," Razor called out. But there was less conviction in his voice now. The crowd's energy was shifting away from him and toward Chuck, and that loss of control was clearly unsettling for someone who had built his entire persona around dominating every room he entered. Chuck stepped through the cage entrance with the same calm deliberation he had shown throughout the entire sequence. Inside the octagon, under the bright lights and surrounded by the deafening noise of the crowd, he looked smaller than he had in the VIP section, not diminished, but somehow more focused, like a blade that had been drawn from its sheath and was revealing its true nature for the first time. The transformation was complete now. Chuck Norris, the OE celebrity guest, had disappeared, replaced by Chuck Norris, the martial artist. The man who had spent five decades learning not just how to fight, but when fighting was necessary and what it was supposed to accomplish. The arena noise reached a crescendo as the crowd realized they were about to witness something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. This wasn't a sanctioned bout with rules and referees and scorecards. This was something primal and fundamental, a confrontation between different philosophies of strength and respect, played out under the brightest lights in the world. The night had reached its tipping point, and there was no going back. The cage had become a temple of tension, every surface reflecting the harsh glare of arena lights that seemed to intensify with each passing second. Chuck Norris and Razor Cade stood 6 feet apart. 2 generations of fighters separated by decades of experience, but united in this crystalline moment of inevitable conflict. The distance between them felt both infinite and non-existent, charged with the kind of energy that precedes lightning strikes. 20,000 voices had merged into something approaching religious fervor, a primal sound that seemed to shake the building's foundation and rattle the steel framework of the cage itself. The crowd had transcended simple entertainment seeking and entered the realm of witnessing. They understood they were about to see something that would be discussed and debated for years to come. Razor forced his trademark grin, but the expression sat uneasily on his face now, like a mask that no longer quite fit properly. The bravado that had carried him through 14 professional victories felt suddenly inadequate against an opponent who radiated calm and the way other men radiated aggression. His usual pre-fight routine, the bouncing, the shadow boxing, the theatrical displays of confidence, all felt hollow and performative in the face of Chuck's absolute stillness. The young fighter's muscles twitched with nervous energy as he bounced on the balls of his feet. Muscle memory and anxiety combining into a display that was equal parts preparation and procrastination. His cornrows were pulled back tight, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the wild gleam in his eyes that spoke to adrenaline levels approaching dangerous territory. "This is it," Razor said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. The microphone had been taken away, but his words carried clearly in the relative quiet that had settled over the arena. "This is your big moment. Some 70-year-old man going to teach me about fighting?" He gestured broadly at the crowd, trying to recapture their energy and redirect it back toward himself. "Y'all are about to see what happens when movie magic meets real violence." Chuck remained motionless, his breathing controlled and even, hands hanging loose at his sides. His stillness was not passive, but predatory. The calm of deep water before the tsunami, the quiet that exists at the eye of the storm. Every fiber of his being was relaxed yet ready, like a coiled spring that had found perfect equilibrium between tension and release. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the front row had to strain to hear, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You talk too much," Chuck said simply. The statement delivered without malice or anger, just the calm observation of someone who had seen this particular type of insecurity countless times before. The comment landed like a physical blow. All of Razor's psychological warfare, his attempts to intimidate and control the narrative, had been dismissed with 4 words that carried the finality of judgment. The young fighter's mouth opened as if to respond, then closed again as he realized he had no comeback for such devastating simplicity. Razor's grin faltered entirely, replaced by something approaching genuine confusion. His entire fighting persona was built on verbal dominance, on breaking opponents mentally before the physical confrontation even began. Having his greatest weapon neutralized so casually left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his earliest amateur bouts. "We'll see about that, old man," Razor finally managed, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Let's see how much talking you do when you're spitting blood." The words hung in the air, like a challenge that had already been answered before it was even issued. The crowd sensed the shift in dynamic where moments before they had been watching a young champion assert his dominance. Now they were witnessing someone desperately trying to convince himself he was still in control of a situation that had already slipped away from him. Without warning, Razor exploded forward, launching himself across the distance between them with the kind of raw athleticism that had made him undefeated. His opening combination was a thing of violent beauty. A left hook designed to set up the right hand, followed by a low kick to compromise balance, finishing with an uppercut that had ended several of his previous fights. It was the same sequence that had begun the demolition of countless opponents, delivered with speed and precision that would have overwhelmed most fighters half Chuck's age. The combination came in a blur of motion, each strike flowing seamlessly into the next, with the kind of technical perfection that separated professional fighters from weakened warriors. Razor's hips twisted with each punch, generating power from his core and transferring it through his shoulders and arms with mechanical efficiency. His footwork was precise, positioning him for maximum leverage while maintaining the balance necessary for follow-up attacks. But Chuck wasn't most fighters. The older man moved with economic efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. His response to Razor's attack coming not a heartbeat later, but somehow simultaneously, as if he had known what was coming before Razor had decided to throw it. He slipped the left hook by mere inches, the punch whistling past his ear close enough to ruffle his hair, but finding only empty air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. The right hand that followed found nothing but the space where Chuck's body had existed moments earlier. The older man had stepped offline with movements so minimal they seemed almost casual, his feet gliding across the canvas like he was dancing to music only he could hear. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish, just pure efficiency of movement that made Razor's aggressive combinations look clumsy by comparison. The low kick that was supposed to buckle Chuck's legs and set up the finishing uppercut meant nothing but empty air. Chuck lifted his leg with perfect timing, allowing Razor's shin to pass harmlessly beneath his knee. The younger fighter's momentum carried him slightly off balance, creating an opening that Chuck noted but chose not to exploit. Yet, Razor's eyes widened slightly as he realized his opponent wasn't where physics said he should be. His combinations were technically perfect, delivered with the kind of speed and precision that had overwhelmed every opponent he had faced in his professional career. But they were striking ghosts passing through spaces that Chuck had already vacated, with movements so subtle they seemed to violate the laws of cause and effect. "Come on," Razor snarled, frustration bleeding into his voice like poison seeping through a wound. "Stand still and fight." But Chuck wasn't interested in accommodating Razor's preferences. His defense was a masterclass in economy of motion, head movement that required only inches rather than dramatic ducks and weaves, footwork that created angles without wasted steps, hands that deflected rather than blocked, redirecting Razor's power back into empty space where it dissipated harmlessly. Each of Chuck's defensive movements was poetry in motion, the accumulated wisdom of 50 years of martial arts training distilled into responses that were both perfectly functional and strangely beautiful. He moved like water flowing around stone, adapting to each attack while maintaining his own structural integrity. The crowd was beginning to sense what the fighters already knew. This wasn't going to be the quick, brutal domination they had witnessed in Razor's previous fights. Every strike the young fighter threw was met with calm competence that made his aggression look childish by comparison, like watching a master craftsman deal with the tantrum of an apprentice. Trent Holloway's voice carried genuine amazement as he tried to describe what he was witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have never seen defensive movement like this. Chuck Norris is making one of the most dynamic strikers in the sport look like he's fighting underwater. The level of technical precision we're seeing here is absolutely extraordinary." Razor pressed forward, desperation beginning to creep into his technique. He threw a wild overhand right that would have ended the fight against most opponents, putting his full weight behind a punch designed to separate consciousness from its host. The strike carried all his frustration and confusion, a haymaker born of the growing realization that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. Chuck leaned back just enough for the strike to pass harmlessly by, the movement so subtle that casual observers might have missed it entirely. Then he stepped forward into the space Razor had created with his overextension, closing the distance with the kind of timing that separated masters from mere practitioners. The counter came without fanfare or warning, a short, sharp jab to Razor's solar plexus that folded him forward and drove the air from his lungs in an audible whoosh that the front row microphones picked up clearly. The strike was perfectly placed, targeting the nerve cluster that would maximize damage while minimizing the risk of permanent injury. It was the punch of someone who understood anatomy as well as technique, who knew exactly how much force was necessary to deliver a lesson without causing lasting harm. Before the younger man could recover from the body shot, Chuck followed with a precise uppercut that snapped Razor's head back and sent him stumbling backward. The punch traveled perhaps 8 in, but carried the accumulated power of decades of training, striking with surgical precision that opened a cut above Razor's eye and sent blood beginning to flow in a thin, steady stream down his cheek. The arena erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for hours. The crowd that had been chanting Chuck's name exploded into something approaching hysteria as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a fight, but a lesson being delivered with surgical precision. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to press against the cage walls and threaten to lift the roof off the building. Razor wiped blood from his nose with the back of his hand, staring at the crimson evidence of his mortality with the kind of shock that comes from discovering you're not invincible after all. The sight of his own blood on his fingers triggered something deeper than physical recognition. A fundamental shift in understanding about his place in the hierarchy of fighters. For the first time in his professional career, he was hurt, confused, and fundamentally outclassed. The taste of copper filled his mouth, and he spat onto the canvas, watching his saliva land with dark red streaks that seemed to mock everything he thought he knew about combat. "Impossible," he muttered. But the word was lost in the crowd's roar. Chuck hadn't moved from his position after delivering the combination. He stood relaxed, breathing normally, showing no signs of exertion despite having just landed the first real damage of the ISO confrontation. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that might have been disappointment, not in his own performance, but in the necessity of teaching this particular lesson in this particular way. The older man's stillness was perhaps more unnerving than any aggressive posturing could have been. He looked like someone who was conducting a science experiment, testing hypotheses about technique and timing with the kind of detached professionalism that spoke to decades of experience with violence as both art and science. Razor circled wearily now, the casual aggression replaced by something approaching genuine respect for his opponent's capabilities. The blood from his cut had reached his mouth, and he could taste the metallic evidence of his vulnerability with each breath. His bouncing had become more measured, less theatrical. The movement of someone who had just learned that showboating could be painful. "Lucky shot," he said. But the bravado was gone, replaced by the kind of grim determination that emerges when survival becomes more important than victory. Chuck's response was to take one step forward, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, but which somehow managed to compress all the space in the cage. The psychological pressure was immense. Razor found himself backing up without consciously deciding to retreat, his body responding to threats his mind hadn't fully processed. The young fighter tried to regain control by unleashing a combination that represented everything he had learned in 10 years of training. He mixed feints and level changes, switched stances mid-combination, varied his targets between head and body to create openings. It was a display of technical skill that would have impressed coaches and commentators alike under different circumstances. A demonstration of the kind of sophisticated striking that separated elite fighters from mere athletes. But Chuck read every movement like he was following along with a book he had written himself. His responses came not after Razor's attacks, but somehow simultaneously with them, as if he possessed some form of temporal awareness that allowed him to see the future. Each counter was precise, minimal, devastating. A check hook that rearranged Razor's features, an elbow that opened another cut, a knee to the body that folded him forward like a broken marionette. The crowd was on its feet now, their noise reaching levels that threatened to overwhelm the arena's sound system and spill out into the Dallas streets beyond. But beneath the celebration was an undercurrent of something approaching awe. They were witnessing mastery in its purest form, artistry expressed through violence that was somehow both brutal and beautiful. Razor's legs began to betray him, the precise shots to his body accumulating damage that sapped his strength and coordination with each exchange. His breathing became labored, his movements less crisp, his confidence eroding like a sandcastle facing an incoming tide. The superior conditioning that had carried him through previous fights seemed inadequate against an opponent who was expending energy with the efficiency of a perfectly tuned machine. But the worst part wasn't the physical damage. It was the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about fighting, about strength, about dominance, was being systematically dismantled by a man who treated violence like meditation, who moved through combat with the same calm precision he might bring to gardening or reading. Chuck moved forward again, and this time Razor's retreat was obvious, desperate. The young fighter threw a wild haymaker born of panic and desperation. A punch that carried all his remaining strength, but none of his technique. It was the kind of strike that desperate fighters threw when they ran out of better options. A Hail Mary attempt to land something, anything, that might change the trajectory of the fight. Chuck stepped inside the strike with perfect timing and ended the lesson with a right cross that traveled perhaps 6 in, but carried the accumulated wisdom of 50 years of martial arts training. The punch found its target with mechanical precision, snapping Razor's head around and sending him crashing to the canvas like a tree falling in a forest that had been cleared of all other sound. The impact of Razor hitting the canvas seemed to suck all the noise out of the arena for one perfect moment. 20,000 people holding their breath as they processed what they had just witnessed. Then the silence shattered like glass, replaced by a roar that seemed to threaten the structural integrity of the building itself. Razor lay motionless on his back, arms spread wide, staring up at the arena lights with the glazed expression of someone trying to remember where they were and how they had gotten there. Blood flowed freely from his nose and the cuts above his eyes, creating abstract patterns on the white canvas that would be photographed and analyzed for years to come. The blood wasn't just physical evidence of the beating he had received. It was symbolic proof that arrogance and talent, no matter how impressive, were no match for experience guided by wisdom, discipline tempered by humility, and strength directed by moral purpose. The silence that followed Chuck's exit from the cage felt sacred, like the moment after lightning strikes when the world holds its breath before the thunder arrives. The arena's 20,000 occupants seemed suspended in a collective pause, processing what they had just witnessed, not merely a fight, but a fundamental shift in understanding about strength, respect, and the consequences of crossing certain moral boundaries. Then the applause began. It started as scattered clapping from the VIP section, where those closest to the action had the clearest view of what had transpired. But it spread like wildfire through the crowd, building from tentative appreciation to thunderous acclaim as people rose to their feet in recognition of something they had never expected to witness. This wasn't the usual bloodthirsty celebration that followed knockouts. This was something deeper, more reverent, the kind of applause reserved for moments that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of education. Razor lay motionless on the canvas for several seconds that stretched like hours, his chest rising and falling in the rhythmic pattern of someone whose consciousness was slowly finding its way back home. The bright arena lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the damage that had been inflicted with such surgical precision. Blood from his nose had created abstract patterns on the white surface beneath his head, and the cut above his eye sent crimson tributaries down his cheek like tears made manifest. Dr. Sarah Chen, The ringside physician was the first to reach him, her experienced hands immediately checking his pupils for signs of serious trauma. She had worked enough combat sports events to recognize the difference between unconsciousness caused by accumulated damage and the clean knockout that results from a perfectly placed shot. This was clearly the latter. Devastating but precise, the work of someone who understood exactly how much force was necessary to deliver a lesson without causing permanent harm. "Ryland, can you hear me? Tell me your name," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone accustomed to dealing with fighters in various states of consciousness. Razor's eyes focused slowly, reality filtering back in waves, like water gradually filling an empty vessel. The arena lights seemed impossibly bright, and the noise of the crowd felt distant and underwater. "I'm what happened." His voice was thick, confused. The arrogance that had defined the evening scrubbed away by 60 seconds of brutal education. "You got knocked out," Dr. Chen said matter-of-factly, her pen light tracking across his pupils to check for signs of concussion. "How many fingers am I holding up?" "2," Razor replied automatically, his cognitive function slowly returning to normal. But as his awareness sharpened, the full weight of what had occurred began to settle on him like a heavy blanket. He had been undefeated for 4 years, had dominated every opponent placed in front of him with combinations of speed, skill, and psychological warfare. He had built his entire identity around being untouchable, invincible, superior to every other fighter in his division. Now he was lying on his back, tasting his own blood, staring up at lights that seemed somehow dimmer than they had before. The metallic taste in his mouth was more than just the result of physical trauma. It was the bitter flavor of humility being force-fed to someone who had forgotten how to swallow it voluntarily. Lita Moreno knelt beside the medical team, her weathered face carrying the complicated expression of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed, but who took no satisfaction in being right. She had seen this moment coming from the first time Razor started believing his own hype, started thinking that talent alone was sufficient to carry him through any challenge. But witnessing the crash was no less painful for being predictable. "Easy, mijo," she said softly, using the Spanish endearment she reserved for moments when Razor needed to remember he was still the troubled teenager she had taken under her wing years ago. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many gifted fighters destroy themselves with pride. "Don't try to sit up yet. Let the doctor do her job." Around them, the cage had become a strange bubble of medical activity surrounded by the continued celebration of Chuck's performance. Photographers captured every moment, but there was something respectful in their approach. They were documenting history, not exploiting vulnerability. Razor's hand moved instinctively to his face, fingers coming away stained with blood that looked impossibly bright under the arena lights. The sight of his own blood on his fingertips seemed to trigger something deeper than physical recognition. A fundamental shift in understanding about his place in the world, his relationship with his own mortality, and the difference between being tough and being truly strong. "He made it look easy," Razor whispered, the words barely audible over the crowd's continued applause for Chuck, who had already disappeared into the tunnel beyond the cage. "I couldn't touch him. I couldn't even see half of what he was doing." The admission carried more weight than any trash talk he had delivered earlier in the evening. For the first time in years, Razor was confronting the possibility that he might not be the apex predator he had imagined himself to be. That there were levels of skill and understanding that existed far beyond his current capabilities. Levels that couldn't be reached through talent alone, but required the kind of discipline and humility he had spent years systematically destroying within himself. Dr. Chen completed her preliminary examination and nodded to the paramedics waiting nearby. Her assessment was professional, but not unkind. She had seen enough fighters in similar situations to understand the psychological trauma that accompanied physical defeat. We need to get him to the medical facility for a full workup. Possible mild concussion definitely needs stitches for that cut, but the damage is clean. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. As the medical team helped Razor to a sitting position and then carefully to his feet, the crowd's attention shifted between the departing fighter and the tunnel where Chuck had vanished. The energy in the arena had transformed from bloodthirsty entertainment to something approaching reverence. People understanding they had witnessed something that transcended sport and entered the realm of legend. The walk from the cage to the medical facility felt like a journey through a different world. Fans who had been cheering Razor's dominance just hours before now watched with expressions ranging from pity to newfound respect. Some called out encouragement not for his fighting ability, but for his humanity. For the vulnerable young man who had just learned a lesson that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Trent Holloway's voice carried genuine awe as he tried to summarize what had just occurred. Ladies and gentlemen, in 30 years of calling fights, I have never seen anything like what we just witnessed. Chuck Norris didn't just win a fight. He delivered a masterclass in discipline, respect, and the difference between talent and wisdom. This wasn't about violence. This was about values. His broadcast partner, Maria Santos, was equally moved. What we saw here tonight was bigger than combat sports. This was about character, about standing up for something more important than personal glory. Chuck Norris reminded us all why we fell in love with martial arts in the first place. Not for the violence, but for the discipline, the respect, the idea that strength without honor is just brutality. In the tunnel leading away from the arena, Chuck walked with the same measured pace he had shown throughout the evening. His white shirt remained crisp, his breathing normal, showing no evidence of the physical confrontation beyond slightly reddened knuckles that would be back to normal by morning. Security personnel and arena staff stepped aside respectfully as he passed. But Chuck seemed unaware of the difference, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with celebration or self. Congratulations. The victory, if it could even be called that, felt hollow rather than triumphant. Chuck had never wanted to hurt the young fighter. He had simply wanted to demonstrate that certain lines couldn't be crossed without consequence. That mockery of faith and disrespect for elders came with a price that talent alone couldn't pay. The lesson had been delivered, but Chuck took no joy in having been forced to deliver it. Denzel Washington appeared in the tunnel, having left his seat to intercept his friend before Chuck disappeared entirely from the public eye. The two men approached each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who had known each other for decades, but rarely needed many words to communicate. In Denzel's expression was gratitude mixed with concern. Appreciation for what Chuck had done, but worry about the personal cost of taking such a public stand. That was necessary, Denzel said quietly, falling into step beside Chuck as they walked toward the exit. And voice carried the weight of someone who understood the difference between violence and justice, between revenge and consequence. Chuck nodded once, his expression thoughtful. Kid had talent, still does. But talent without respect always leads to the same place. Flat on your back, wondering how you got there. Think he learned anything? Chuck considered this for several seconds before responding. His answer coming from decades of experience with prideful young fighters who had been humbled by reality. Pain teaches lessons that success never can. Whether he chooses to learn from this or just gets angry about it, that's up to him. I did what I could do. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who had spent their lives in different arenas, but who understood the same fundamental truths about strength, character, and the responsibility that came with both. The noise from the arena was fading behind them, replaced by the quieter sounds of a building gradually returning to normal operations. "Thank you," Denzel said finally. "Not for me. I didn't need defending, but for what you defended. Faith isn't something that needs a bodyguard, but it doesn't hurt to have someone remind the world that it's not weakness." "Faith isn't weakness," Chuck replied simply. "Sometimes it takes strength to show strength, but more often it takes strength to show restraint. Tonight called for both." Behind them, the arena was slowly beginning to empty, but the conversations were different than usual. Instead of debates about betting odds and knockout highlights, people were discussing respect and character and the difference between confidence and arrogance. Videos of the confrontation were already spreading across social media, but the captions weren't celebrating violence. They were discussing values, sharing quotes about humility and strength, using the moment as an opportunity to reflect on their own behavior and choices. In the medical facility beneath the arena, Razor sat on an examination table while Dr. Chen cleaned the cut above his eye and prepared to suture it closed. The room was quiet, except for the soft sounds of medical equipment and the distant rumble of the crowd still filing out of the building. Lita stood nearby, watching her fighter with the expression of someone reassessing a situation she thought she understood. The young man on the table was different from the one who had entered the cage. The arrogance was gone, scrubbed away by violence and replaced with something that might have been wisdom, or at least the beginning of it. His eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there in months, as if the physical trauma had somehow cleared away psychological debris that had been accumulating for years. "This is going to leave a scar," Dr. Chen said matter-of-factly, as she began the delicate work of closing the wound. Her hands were steady and sure, but she had seen enough fighters to know that physical scars often healed more easily than the psychological ones. "Good," Razor said quietly, surprising both women with the conviction in his voice. "Maybe I need a reminder." The comment hung in the air like a prayer or a promise. Lita moved closer, studying her fighter's face for signs of the bitter anger she had expected to find. Instead, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Humility. The arrogance that had been growing like a cancer in Razor's personality had been surgically removed in 60 seconds of perfect violence, leaving behind someone who might actually be teachable again. "Ryland," she said carefully, using his real name to signal the seriousness of the moment. "What are you thinking right now?" Razor was quiet for a long moment as Dr. Chen worked. The small pain of the sutures, nothing compared to the larger discomfort of having his worldview fundamentally altered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the bravado that had defined his public persona for years. "I'm thinking about how much I don't know," he said, his words coming slowly, as if he was discovering them in the process of speaking them. "How much I thought I knew that was just nothing. Hot air and ego and fear dressed up as confidence." He looked at his trainer through eyes that were clearer than they had been in months, free from the fog of constant validation seeking that had clouded his judgment. "Lita, I want to start over. Not my career, my training, my understanding. I want to learn what he knows. I want to understand what real strength looks like." The request surprised Lita, but it also filled her with something approaching hope. The young man who had ignored her advice and attacked a respected elder was gone, replaced by someone who might actually be willing to put in the years of work required to become not just a better fighter, but a better person. "That's going to take time," she warned, her voice gentle but honest. "Years, probably. And it means admitting that everything you thought you knew about strength was wrong." It means starting from the beginning like a white belt who's never thrown a punch. Razor nodded, wincing slightly as the motion pulled against Dr. Chen's careful work. I know. But I also know that what happened out there, that wasn't luck. That wasn't age catching up with youth. That was mastery meeting arrogance. And arrogance got schooled. As Dr. Chen finished her work and applied a neat bandage over the cut, Razor studied his reflection in the small mirror mounted on the examination room wall. The face looking back at him was different somehow, not just because of the visible damage, but because the person behind the eyes had been fundamentally altered by the evening's events. The scar above his eye would heal in time, but it would remain as a permanent reminder of the night he learned that true strength wasn't measured in victories or knockouts or social media followers. It was measured in character, in discipline, in the ability to stand for something larger than yourself when the moment required it, and in the wisdom to know when to fight and when to walk away. 3 hours later, as the arena staff finished cleaning up and the last of the fans filtered out into the Dallas night, the only physical evidence of what had occurred was the dark stains on the canvas where Razor's blood had fallen. But the real impact of the evening would spread far beyond the confines of the building, rippling outward in ways that would influence young fighters and old legends alike, changing conversations in gyms and living rooms across the world. The lesson had been delivered, received, and understood. What happened next would determine whether tonight had been the end of one story or the beginning of another entirely different one. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.